Yep, and we are live. So, welcome, guys. Welcome to Critical African Thinkers. This is a place where nothing escapes scrutiny. We examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain that which is factual and logically consistent. So, today we are starting sort of a new series on this channel where we just choose a topic and probably we don't even choose a topic. We just talk spontaneously on the issues, on things, burning issues that have happened over the week. And this is the maiden edition of this series. I believe it's going to be a very, very interesting series. I believe it's going to make a whole lot of sense because many of these spontaneous discussions actually are they're more natural, they're more interesting to me. So, Chloe, um, you sent something on Discord channel today about bedtime, people wanting to cancel bedtime and all that. So I wanted that to form the crux of the conversation today and how it relates to, people want to cancel everything and seeing everything as oppressive. Can you go through the basic idea of what that video was about for us?
So, yeah. So apparently there is, at least in some spaces online, and I think more particularly Twitter, in which there are people, and one can assume like teenagers, children, like legally children, who are taking these ideas of power and oppression and kind of attacking all forms of power imbalance, and they're applying it down to the idea of a bedtime, right? That, in terms of within a family, the parents have a power imbalance against the children, and therefore it's wrong for parents to enforce a bedtime. Because, of course, naturally, when we're all kids, we want to stay up as late as we want. And, we kind of begrudge, our parents saying, no, it's time to go to bed. You have school in the morning. And because it acknowledges that we have structure in our lives, we have to be taught how to meet the obligations of the outside world. So and yeah, if you're a kid going to school, you have to have an enforced bedtime generally, so that you can be you know awake and alert when you go to school, which is another structure that is enforced. And it's also another, how they consider another power dynamic. And so, kind of attacking all power dynamics, there are people who are now attacking the power dynamic of bedtime, that it is oppressive, that parents shouldn't do this, they shouldn't enforce their power and will over a child to tell them when to go to bed. And it's also has an assumption that a child is um that a child has the capacity and um the responsibility, of can bear the responsibility of dictating their own bedtime and bearing the consequences of that, which I don't think they do.
No, that's no. This is just crazy because it seems like every sort of hierarchy is under attack, whether or not it's good. Every sort of form of power is under attack. Every form of authority is under attack, whether or not it's beneficial or not. How can children make decisions for themselves? Why do they have parents in the first place if their parents are not there to make the tough decisions that these kids cannot make? Because there's a reason why they're children in the first place. There's a reason why they're kids, and there's a reason why they have a legal guardian till they're about 18 years old. It's because there are certain decisions they frankly cannot make for themselves. Anyhow, before I run too much, let's. Benjamin is here. Dr. Sheena is here. So Benjamin, let's hear your thoughts.
Hi, folks. I think that the idea of an enforced bedtime being like white supremacist is kind of laughable, but so many of the things that are, kind of I don't know, put under that category are pretty laughable. So I don't know.
Well, to be fair, they weren't criticizing it as white supremacists. They were criticizing it as capitalistic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right actually, and I don't know. I'd say that that's just about as laterally strange in terms of like a thought process as the other one too. But yeah, nope. Good point.
Yeah, Dr. Shina, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything profound to add, except for the fact that number one, I didn't see what Chloe shared, so I need to catch up on that. But based on what has been said, it does seem a bit ludicrous, and I agree that there's something dangerous about the fact that people are increasingly and indiscriminately attacking anything that has to do with some level of authority or somebody being in power over somebody else. And I think, especially when we're talking about children in this context, that seems very strange. And so I'd love to hear more about the context, or if this is also being, how this is also playing out in other aspects of society.
Yeah, I can give a little bit more context. This is mostly kind of being done in more communist Twitter, not even like, I wouldn't even say like socialist, but like communists. These people are, well, I would think like they're younger, but some of these people are older too, and that also makes me kind of suspicious. But they are questioning. It's like, you get into the phase of questioning authority, and then you kind of get a hold of the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, and then you kind of now have this lens of, I know everything that's wrong with society, and it's because everyone has more power than me, right? And especially from the perspective of, someone who's still probably legally a child. They don't, but they're almost an adult, and they are, they want a framework in which they can um delegitimize, the control that their parent has over their life. Like, no, you can't get a nose ring, no, you can't get a tattoo, no, you can't stay up all night, no, you can't go over to that friend's house, I don't want you drinking, I don't like your friends, I don't want you. I think it's an expression of an anxiety that I think, for like the older kind of people, they're using it. They're using that basic anxiety of a teenager not feeling in full in control of their life to kind of say, there is a political way that you can channel this if you kind of join this type of political action, in order to kind of liberate yourself or all these people from this oppressive regime of your parents. And it's kind of weird where you know it's kind of the logic of, kind of distrusting your parents, distrusting, like, your family unit, and looking at all of these relationships so cynically, right? You just trust everyone that has more power than you, and you never think about the fact that they are responsible for you, and that you have to be, it's until you're responsible for yourself, because that's an aspect that everyone kind of forgets, is that, you know uh just responsibility, and that there's a price to that. Like, yeah, your parent is responsible for you. They, tell you, can tell you to do all of these things, but if something bad happens to you, they're held responsible for that. You aren't held responsible for that if you're a child, but your parent is. And so it's they ignore the basis of responsibility I think on a fundamental level. But again, if you're a child, you don't have a concept of this yet. But and I think politically, some people are using that blind spot for a lot of these young kids.
This is making me think a lot about. I was just having a discussion yesterday with someone about how, at least in Western society, there's often a very binary way of viewing what seems like everything under the sun. And in my conversation, how it played out was this idea of the individual versus the society, the community, the collective. And in similar ways, when you're speaking of this, it's making me think of how uh, being being having communist or socialist inclinations uh, has become a sort of dirty word or something that one shouldn't partake in, let's say. But I myself am aligned with different socialist practices, and I also look at American society within the context of class. So I do a lot of class analysis, and a lot of my reasoning behind my theory of racistness is inspired by the recognition that a lot of why I think racism matters most in America has to do with socioeconomic status and stuff like that. And so, in that way, I see race, or what I call racialist language, racialist ideology, working to keep people divided across these perceived racial slash racist lines. Because if our eyes were more open, we would actually come to recognize that we should be focusing on class, and that our interests are actually more aligned in terms of class as opposed to this so-called race, right, or racial groups. Um, so I just want to throw that out there, that it seems to me that this question of, I guess, democracy versus communism or socialism, this question of power versus being oppressed, right, or oppressor versus the oppressed, or society versus individual, there's a way in which what's absent from both sides, which I'm putting the word sides in quotation marks, is discourse about how two things can be happening at once, and that would probably lead to a more positive generative society for more people. That is to say, we can maintain our democratic, structures, but we can adopt certain socialist practices, just as many countries around the world do, to the benefit of more people. And in the way in which there are power imbalances or perceived authorities and things of that nature, hierarchies, that not all hierarchies are made equal, right? Like in the instance of parent versus child. And then it also makes me think about how people seem hyper focused on the individual to the exclusion of talking about anything to do with community or collective or social, right? And then inversely, hyper focused on society and sort of leaving out the role of the individual, to the point where somebody yesterday was telling me the individual doesn't, like, it doesn't matter what an individual does because the society is oppressing them, right? Society is basically dictating that person's future, which I really want to dispel that kind of thinking and thought. So I don't know if that makes any logical sense to why my mind was making those connections with what you said, Chloe, but that's kind of where my brain took me.
I do think that it is a balance of, if how you, the individual versus the collective, but then also you have to define collective, because we do have free association, right? Like, I can choose to join a church, and I can choose to live my life by the principles that the church, dictates for their members, right? And if that doesn't work for me anymore, then I can leave and then maybe join a different church. And if I can't leave, it's probably a cult, like in the worst sense. But and but kind of the same thing for like my neighborhood. Like, I personally chose to join an HOA so I can actually, I am forced to interact with my neighbors, and I'm forced to like understand, they know me, I know them, and I understand the decisions that are happening in this community. While there's some people that literally will never join a meeting, and then later on they complain about, why did you guys do this, why did you raise dues? And it's like, you could have come to the meetings and you could have been a full participant of the process. And so I think it's about, I completely agree, like, at least in America, we have somewhat of free association, except with our families. We kind of can't choose the families that we're born into. And I understand that anxiety for some people, of where they can freely choose all these other things, but they can't choose their family. But it's just a fact of biology, honestly. And unless, your family was so, was so horrible that you're taken away by child protective services or something like that. But I think that kind of getting back to like for like, you know, socialism and then versus democracy, I think socialism, its appeal is more radical democracy, right? Democracy in the workplace, more democracy in, you know, everyone has a voice and everyone, you know, can vote for certain things and to enforce rules based off of you know, majority vote. But then, like you said, Sheena, there is that conflict of society versus the individual, because at that point, you know, we don't want a whole society to vote away the rights of the individual. And I understand now, especially with the COVID like, you know, mandates and regulations, that kind of feels like something that's happening, but that's not necessarily specifically related to this topic. But I wanted to definitely highlight something that this is kind of related to. And it kind of goes into how these kind of discourses are slowly creeping into overstepping their bounds of basic, you know, hierarchy structures of like parent child. Like there's no way that a child is going to be born from the womb fully cognizant of everything and able to survive on their own. They have to be dependent on the adult, and the adult um has to raise them. And so, but this is something weird that I've seen, right? And it's kind of like this slow kind of, they're try to chip away at the family unit, as if this is like another last part that, you know, finally they're going to get like a communist revolution. And I'm not going to associate this with like specifically socialist, but I've seen, and I've met people that, you know, they completely disagree with the idea of telling their child that they're raising what their sex is, like so that they can be free of the constraints of what gender is or what sex is, right? And in this case they want to, it seems like they want to free women of family, right? Because, and I guess like this is how you kind of you know, to kind of chip away at the family, because the child is the last person that is kind of attached to women in terms of a family structure. Like a guy can, you know, have a kid with a woman and then kind of never be seen again, and then, you know, that connection is still there. And then kind of, it's kind of it seems like a next step of quote unquote liberation. And so for this discourse, they're kind of doing it from the child end. But I have seen discourse like on Vice, literally, of advocating for full surrogacy now, in which like they're literally advocating for, you know, there should be a government program in which um, women aren't burdened by raising children, or like in the way that we get new citizens is that women are literally paid to be surrogates, and then, you know, children are communally raised so that both like the parents are free to be individuals but in a collective, right? Or to do collective work. And I know this sounds like a weird kind of crazy conspiracy theory, but like I've literally listened to narrative podcasts where this was literally the case. This is the world that was laid out in this um like in this world. Like, and when I realized I heard it in a different place, and then I'm like, oh wait, this is the basis of this podcast, or this the story, where it's like this world where they abolished family. They literally abolished family. That's the basis of the story, so that they could achieve communism, right? And it's from all these different perspectives of people either in the government or people who are in government facilities to be corrected of their family affiliation, or people who are secretly like, who have to steal away into the woods to have families. And so it's just, I just don't, it's just kind of weird where I just don't think it's an aberrant sticking point, that there is actually a point in which they're tripping away at certain things that um, are kind of disquieting.
I definitely agree with all that. Um, you know, one of the things that I'm thinking about, and this is going back again to kind of like government and you know, the different modes of government, the different theories of government that people, you know, subscribe to. And I've always thought of these things kind of on a continuum, or I guess there's also this thing called horseshoe theory, which I don't know well enough to describe at this moment. But basically, my understanding is that, you know, you've got lawlessness on one side, which is the total anarchy, versus self-government, versus some sort of totalitarianism or authoritarianism on the far right extreme. And ultimately, I think that what we end up doing is we kind of, irrespective of political alignment, you're always kind of ping ponging between lawlessness and authoritarianism to a degree. And I think that one of the things that arguably the West has done fairly well is to enshrine some aspects of self government in our Constitution, specifically in America, that gives a certain amount more freedom. But there's this understanding, though, that if you're going to be the one who is responsible for your own actions, then you take on all of the responsibility for that. The lawlessness I see in the streets when it comes to maybe people who are protesting too vociferously, that is definitely one side of the spectrum. And yet at the same time, a lot of the things that they seem to be fighting against, they seem to be fighting against what they call totalitarianism. But the words that they use and the way that they go about it seems in its own way to be kind of authoritarian. So it's a very confusing thing. I get the feeling that if people are attacking capitalism, it's because capitalism enshrines hierarchies to a degree and sees them as useful and necessary. And if you're attacking the hierarchy of the family, for example, the responsibility and authority of a parent to tell their child to go to bed, because otherwise there's an opportunity cost of, hey, if you don't go to bed early enough, you're not going to sleep very well, and then you won't be able to get up to go to school, and you're going to be groggy, and then you're going to fall behind in class, and maybe you're not going to be able to get along as well with people, and then other kids won't like you, and there's all these spiraling out consequences of not going to bed early. you know i I don't want to kind of take up too much of this conversation, but it seems to me that we're both looking at an issue of kind of finding a sweet spot on this continuum of lawlessness, self-government, and totalitarianism, and also trying to understand that, like, there are opportunity costs, there are incentives, there are these various things that you know um, that children are not really able to know until their parents teach them, and as they get older they get more aware of it. And I think that some people just want to kind of undermine that because it goes against their narrative. Does that sound like reasonable?
Yeah, it does. Now, I would say this, that I really don't understand the attack on capitalism as supporting a hierarchy. I believe hierarchies exist in any economic system, in any political system. In fact, in any system at all, hierarchies would always exist as long as there's some sort of social order. People will arrange themselves according to certain hierarchies, either by competence, either by whatever criteria. If you're even looking at a socialist system, there's still going to be a hierarchy. There's still going to be some form of government. As this, there's still going to be someone at the head of that government. That person at the head of government is not going to have the same rights as every other person in society. So tying hierarchies to capitalism, I I really don't get the connection. I don't get how capitalism is singled out to be the scapegoat for everything that is wrong with the West. I mean, it's just taken out. There is this. It seems to me that people do not think through the problems enough for them to just assign it to something. Just like in the discourse we're having these days, if you don't agree with someone, you can just call them a dash phobe, or you can call them a white supremacist, and those labels don't make any sense because they are not thinking through the processes. They are not thinking through the words they're using. They're not even thinking through the definitions. They're just saying this is what it is. And you see very smart, very intelligent people use that argument all the time. It's capitalism that led to the breakdown of the family. And I'm asking how do you tie an economic system to the breakdown of the family? It could just as easily have happened under the socialist system or any other system. So I don't know. I don't know. Then as to your point about this trade-off between, individualism, government, totalitarianism, uh, in my mind, there's always there's supposed to be a balance. We cannot be too individualistic, neither can we give too much power to the government. So that is why there has to be some sort of agreement on, okay, how much power do we give to the government and how much can we reserve for ourselves. And like Chloe said, the West had found a way to make that balance for at least a reasonable amount of time until now. People are beginning to just wanting to unravel the whole system and just, I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me. It really doesn't.
Um, yeah, I think that they one of the big criticisms of capitalism, or I hear sometimes where like people blame something. I was like, oh, this is capitalism, but it could be corporatism. Like, I don't think that they understand the idea of capitalism is like, let's say I have 5 apples, and then someone wanted an apple, and they had $1, and they gave me the apple. I gave them the apple for the dollar. Like, that's capitalism. But they kind of they I think that they see it as a very uncaring system, right? It doesn't matter if you had a bad day, or it doesn't matter that you just lost your dog, or if you can't objectively perform XYZ thing for whatever reason. Capitalism is in a way, it's thankfully, and I guess unfortunately, it doesn't care about all that type of stuff. It's a very simple system in which, if you have the money, or if you have the material, if you have the means, then you can kind of make things happen within those constraints of how much money you have, or resources that you have. And it's kind of, it doesn't take into account very individual, personal, emotional, possibly even emotional things, right? And I think that, especially the type of people that criticize capitalism, they don't have the means in which they can feel that they can fully participate in it, and they feel that it's unfair. And therefore, it's like, I have so many good qualities, I have so much XYZ, and why can't that be the currency in which I can get a house that I want, or get um, get a car, or be able to go to school. And I think that now there's this kind of weird discourse in which people are being convinced that there's no way to make it in the system if you don't immediately start out with a bang, able to afford all of these things and be able to fully participate right away. And I think that it's a kind of anxiety of the uncertainty of how you navigate a system that isn't human, right? It's a tool. It's just a tool, but because people are at the end of the inputs and outputs, they assume that it should be more quote unquote human than it is as a tool.
Yeah, I agree that it's a tool, and that's the more reason why I don't get why you would want people people want to ascribe either ethics to a market system. You described capitalism as sort of a system of exchange. I have apples, you have money, let us exchange it. It's a tool, and you can't blame the tool for doing what it's designed to do. Probably some of these other issues that we're attributing to as failures of capitalism may actually be failures of families, it might be failures of society, it might be failures of something else, it might be failures of the church, it might be failures of community. Those are the other structures that are supposed to give the supports that people need to have in their lives. You don't expect to get the same kind of response from your job as you will get from your family. But when you start conflicting both, then there's a real issue there. That's when you start saying that, oh, your boss doesn't care about you. Well, is it the job of your boss to give you that emotional support? You guys came there to exchange goods and services, and when you're done, you go back to your family and get the sort of support that you need, and not wanting it from your job. So that's what I think anyway. And I think that a lot of this criticism of capitalism is unfounded. Elizabeth said something that abuse of any system is what needs to be exposed, which is true. Chloe made a comment that it might just be corporatism. Some of what you people ascribe to as capitalism might just be corporatism, or it might just be an abuse of the system. And there is no system that is immune to abuse. So even if we set up a socialist utopia tomorrow, there's still going to be abuses to that system because on in the long run, there's only one factor that is constant: human beings. Human beings are the ones running the system. And as long as human beings are running the system, there's going to be corruption because our human nature will come into it.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely one thing. I saw this comment somewhere and I totally, agree with it. So, like, I agree with capitalism, but personally, I don't agree with consumerism, right? I don't like to see the excesses of like someone choosing to, you know, rack up a bunch of credit card debt to eat out every night at fast food restaurants or to buy a fancy car or to buy things that they don't necessarily need or that might distract them from making kind of meaningful like changes and connections in their life. There are some people like they do retail therapy where they decide to I'm going to make myself feel better, so I'm going to buy $500 worth of makeup. And I know people that have done this. They choose to focus on a kind of superficial aspect of themselves, and they purchase things in order to artificially enhance it. But at the end of the day, they still have that insecurity, which then means that next paycheck they're probably going to go back and do more retail therapy. And so I think that there needs to be, I think is kind of the theme of this is balance, right? Is all going to be about balance of when do you, we're all between, two different ends of any spectrum. And we have to figure out what place in between do we dial into to have the most, benefit for ourselves. Right. And I think that it's complicated. We constantly have to recalibrate ourselves. We constantly have to, we can't just relax. And I see that there's an appeal to just having something that's super simple, it's super easy, right? Just pick this one thing anytime, every time. If there's ever any power dynamic, you try to dismantle it, and that should just give good results forever. And it's an easy choice, and you don't have to think about it. It's not something that if you're in a group of everyone who thinks the same thing, it's an easy choice. But there's going to be a lot of conflict because they still have to balance their reality of it's not really working. And I don't think it's going to work if we just give up everything to the collective. Like, let's say in the video that I kind of shared, they were talking about like, oh, we should have collective kitchens, right? So people shouldn't be cooking for themselves or by themselves or whatever. But you think about dietary constraints. What if there's someone who's gluten intolerant who can't cook, you can't eat food where someone had made toast on the pan, and then someone's going to go through anaphylactic shock? Like, we have to have some sense of protection of our own individuality, sometimes literally for our own safety and health.
So basically substituting one parent for the bigger parents, which is the government. That's what they just did there. They didn't change anything. They just took the authority of one parent and they gave it to a bigger parent to be able to oversee everything.
Yeah, but it's the form of a parent that they feel like they have influence on. Like, if they all vote for this way, like if everyone votes to, we all don't have to go to work tomorrow, and everyone says yes, great, everyone's happy, and you kind of, like an appeal to the majority essentially. And yeah, I can see that going wrong.
Exactly, because majority opinions, those who are fighting for this today, probably they feel they are in the majority. What about the majority tomorrow disagrees with their position? What happens then? And the earlier example you made about someone who just consumes to make themselves feel better because somehow they feel that if they buy stuff that they don't need, it will make them. How exactly is that a fault of capitalism? That's a fault of a personal character. That's a character flaw. You've not developed yourself very well. You don't know what makes you happy. You're easily influenced, and you have made a personal choice to go. Fine, maybe companies are involved in advertising and so many other things to grab people's attention to get these goods. But at the end of the day, they're not going to force you to bring out your money to buy these things. It's still going to be a personal choice. It's still going to be you wanting or desiring this thing. So how exactly is that also a failure of capitalism? That's it's a
I
failure of the
agree.
developmental process of a human being.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Charles. I think that you're right. I think that one of the things that is a real problem in this discussion is just conflation in general. People conflate capitalism with, for example, just free markets and the action of free markets. Like, I'm, I will say, I'm not an economist or like a person who studies a lot of government stuff, but it seems funny to me that capitalism it's a very broad term. I don't know that it only means free markets. I think that there's maybe a little bit, if we were to try and look at some of the specific issues of capitalism, we might find that the action of markets is not necessarily, or free markets is not necessarily the thing that's at fault with it. People conflate capitalism with free markets, but the other thing that I wanted to mention is, I there is one critique of capitalism that I've heard from Brett Weinstein, who is a biologist, and he talked about biological senescence, and senescence means essentially growing old, and that in a particular uh, individual organism, there are genes that are coded to do certain things at certain times. Now, my understanding of his comments on this were that, um, at a certain point in the life cycle, for example, for young people, having a robust immune system, having rapidly growing, bones and muscles that are able to develop well, having good cognitive development, all of those things are to a certain degree influenced by your genes, and so it would make sense to put your eggs into the basket of, you know when the organism is going to be young, selecting for those things. I'm not a biologist. I don't know, or a geneticist. I don't know all of the factors at work here. But my understanding is just that, it's pretty straightforward. If the organism dies when it's young, then you don't have to worry about, what possible issues come with age. On the other hand, selecting for some of these genes that are better for us when we're young may have deleterious effects later on in life. It might affect, essentially various things that might cause us to be more prone to certain diseases, especially like cancers, things like that. The idea is that we chose a genetic blueprint that selected for healthy children, not necessarily for adults with crazy longevity. What he then went on to talk about with regards to capitalism is that maybe capitalism is going through its own version of senescence. Maybe capitalism, as it develops, as it grows old, starts to get a little bit more riddled with tumors and cancers. It gets more corrupted as things go. Um, I think that might be true. I think there might be aspects of that are true. I think though that, it would be reasonable to kind of go forward and look into that further, and try and see if there's some validity to that, because I think that might actually be a reasonable critique of capitalism. It doesn't mean that capitalism is bad or that it doesn't work. It actually is a much more cogent argument than just saying capitalism is bad, because we know that short term capitalism does many, many, many good things, and it's not very difficult to, um, to prove that. But the long-term aspects of capitalism are some of the things that we don't know as much about, and maybe we should study more.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that in the sense of, we have a government that is within a capitalist system that's supposed to, interfere in some ways, like with regulations. And there are definitely scenarios in which there are certain, legal monopolies or certain ways that an established business or established association of different businesses or professionals decide to regulate the market where they can basically prevent actual competition coming into the market for them. So one example was that I have actually two interesting examples. So there was this one woman who I think she had a YouTube channel. She did makeup, right? She taught makeup, and so what she wanted to do, and I think this was somewhere in North Carolina or something like that, and what she wanted to do was basically open up a physical business, a studio, in which women would come with their own makeup, and she would teach them in person how to apply their makeup well. But what happened was her business was shut down by the estheticians association. And they made the argument of, well, you're dealing with touching people's skin, and that's so dangerous. You can have a flesh-eating disease and all that kind of stuff. And so they use their pre-established expertise and doing much more dangerous uh, procedures and kind of lump that in, because if you go to those type of spa places, they also have people who do makeup, and that kind of eats into their business. And so I think this person, she sued for the right of saying this is completely unrelated market. There's they're what the reason they kind of trumped up their authority, claiming that only under the authority of them certifying people that people can be safe from flesh-eating bacteria on their own faces. Oh, Steve was here and then he dropped out. Oh, that's too bad. And in a different scenario, I think this was in Ohio, there was a woman who, I think she was actually an African immigrant. So what she did was she did hair braiding, but then again, her business was shut down because it said, oh, you have to go through hair school. You have to learn how to do all this stuff, mostly with go through all this education of learning how to process Caucasian hair for the most part, so that she can braid African hair in her own home. And again, they claimed, another thing of safety. And so those are aspects of which I see that people are latching on and kind of perverting and kind of making the markets less free for their own benefit, so that the markets are funneled in for them. Except for the people that go to them as an association, pay them money to get certified, go to their schools, and et cetera, et cetera.
But is that capitalism though? Is that not an aberration of capitalism? Because if it's supposed to be a free market, then anybody should be able to compete in that market without short obstructions. Oh, who's
I think
there is a noise coming from? Should be Steve.
Oh.
Okay, so I've muted him.
Yeah,
What's up?
Hi Steve, what's up? Welcome to the
Hey,
stream.
what's up, Charles? Thank you.
I'm good. Yeah. So you've been following the conversation. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm still at work, but I am listening and paying attention. Was there a specific question that you wanted to ask me?
Oh no.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm waiting to chime in. So, carry on.
Okay. So, Chloe, like as I was saying, that seems to me like a case of government overreach, which is where we want to find a balance between how much powers do we want to give the government for the benefit of everybody versus how much power we need to retain for ourselves. In a truly free market or a capitalist society, that shouldn't be the case, where organizations or bodies backed by the government get to determine who can get into a certain business or not. So yeah, if they're going to use that as a critique of capitalism, I think it falls short as a critique of capitalism.
Yeah, it's not real capitalism, but I find it interesting. We've already kind of talked about this in terms of schools, right? Like that's the only type of debt that the government has said you can't file bankruptcy for, and that's student loan debt, and which basically guarantees the money for all of these people who are providing school loans, and then that increases the incentive for all of these universities and colleges to increase their administrative cost and basically treat their students as customers and not students, and that a degree is a product, not like a sign that someone has gone through rigorous intellectual study, right? um, and so I think that it's interesting of like all the signs that they point to of how capitalism is failing are more so of a sign of maybe we should cut back on government interfering in these things, because we should allow these markets to actually go their course, and they will self-correct by themselves. We don't need a government to decide what the correct setting it is for you know how many businesses, or how business is going for this industry. It should actually regulate itself to a certain extent. But I understand for like something like medicine, of like making sure that they're following you know basic guidelines of safety, and that they're doing proper testing for something that's going to be released for the public. Stuff like that I understand. But for things like hair care or even education at this point, um, I think we need to relax. It's good to explore having government to relax its control over those aspects of those subjects.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the other thing that I'll just mention too. Um, a small anecdote. I was unemployed for about 6 months up until a little bit ago, and I live in the U.S. and my state had a unemployment program, of course, and I basically went in to try to find out, hey, can I get signed up and everything? I got signed up, and then I didn't get a single like check from them the entire time that I was unemployed. And it wasn't for lack of trying. They asked me to provide all this different documentation. At the end of the first month out of those 6 months, I had given them everything that they needed to know. I kept up to date with updating them every couple weeks, as I was supposed to. I basically followed all the rules, and ultimately, it didn't end up doing anything for me. I'm still waiting on that money. I guess my point is just this, that the government can be counted on to administer something based off of laws. It cannot be counted on to administer things efficiently. I've just seen so many examples in my own life where it's like, hey, if there was a private company that was, basically doing this on behalf of the government and receiving funds from the government in the form of taxpayer dollars to do the work, it would be done so much better. And I don't know. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, that's the basis of why, like for the DoD, they hire businesses like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon and a whole bunch of other defense contractors, because it is and it's very stark at the differences of the what is the pay structure. So like defense contractors get paid more, but it's easier to fire them, right? But for a government employee, they make less, but it's it's harder to fire them. So I'll give you an example. There's one government worker or like employee, it's kind of in IT, right? And his responsibility is he moves, there's like a government computer where you can access a special government email that you have. And so his job is to move that computer. If you move offices, he moves that computer from one room to another room That's all he does. He moves that computer. He will not move the power cable. He will not move the mouse. He will not move the keyboard. He just moves that one computer from one room to another room. and you know, you have to get on a schedule to get this guy to move your computer. And you're like, I just literally moved across the hall and I moved everything else. And I know I can physically just pick it up and move it. But we have to wait for this one guy to move this one computer from one room to another room. And that's all he does. And it's just kind of like you see like the contrast as opposed to, you know, a contract worker who, you know, if they you know, it's if they fail to perform or deliver on certain basic metrics, like they can get fired. They can easily, it's a quicker process to fire those people than this one guy who, you know, is like, hey, I've been waiting 3 weeks for this guy to move this computer across the hall. What's going on? You know, you just have to wait. There's no recourse at all for this process. It's just, it's frustrating. Yeah.
Can we go back to the critique of capitalism really quick?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So I think, in my personal opinion, I'm a diehard capitalist. You know, I love capitalist systems, but yet you still have to be honest about the failings of the system that you support. Otherwise, you're just being intellectually dishonest, right? So, you know, we can take examples of where capitalism has gone wrong. You know, child labor. We have regulations on building houses because we know that, you know, people will build substandard homes and then people get hurt. So to some degree, regulations and laws are required because sometimes human beings don't do what's in the best interest for others. And so when we well, let me rephrase that. So we need to not keep ourselves in that echo chamber or even in a epistemological bubble, which is when you push information out. And it doesn't hurt to listen to these people that criticize capitalism because they might be right. There might be something wrong with this particular system within capitalism. And if we address it, we can possibly save money, we can save lives. So I don't always take their criticisms seriously unless there's actually a serious address of the issues at hand. And you can tell because sometimes it'll be a thinly veiled attack at some obscure part of capitalism, and you're like, okay, you know, that's ridiculous. But then someone might have an actual legitimate concern, and their concern would be, you know, with Chloe's example, it is ridiculous that we employ a man to move a computer from one side of an office to another. You know, that's costing taxpayers probably millions of dollars a year because there's probably dozens of those people at every base. You know, and so we also have to admit that the end game of capitalism isn't where we're at right now. It's almost like a living, breathing being. It functions very chaotically, and we have to be attenuated to the intricacies of how it functions so we can continue to grow this experiment in economics. So when they criticize capitalism, it's a criticism of where capitalism is right now. And so that's just what I wanted to add.
Yeah. So kind of what you said makes me think of something which the kernel of which I can see what they're hinting at it, or they don't realize that this is kind of the problem that they kind of constantly keep making when they keep talking about like the collective. They want, you know, collective communes again, but they don't want collective commune of like the size of New York City. They want smaller communities again, like 200 people, which is kind of, I forgot the name of the number of how many people you can kind of keep in your head and have a relationship with all these people.
200. It's 200 maximum.
Yeah. And so I think it's an issue of scale right? I mean, capitalism is works very well when you have to trade with people that you don't know. And and that's why, credit scores, at least in the United States, started, right? Like we're starting to have commerce with people and try to, provide loans and manage debt. And how do you trust people when you don't know them? And the scope of how many businesses, how many customers a business can see in a day, and also like how far reaching like a single business, like how many people we can interact with. So like for example, like if it's easier to scam people today than it was before, because you don't have to see this person that you're stealing the money of, right? There are a bunch of people who, would claim that they have like this amazing weight loss plan, right? And then you just find out it's a starvation diet, but you still paid 99.99 for 4 months straight just to get this weird plan. And so it's easier to um anonymize, or just disassociate from the fact that there's a real person that gave you the money. And in a smaller community, you would have to probably look them in the face. And so in that sense, more people who actually probably had psychopathy would be more likely to be the type of people that would do those things. But at the same time, the community will easily find out, and oh no, they fell in a river and they never got out again. If that we actually had mechanisms to manage and those types of antisocial behaviors. But now when everything's anonymous, you can create a business and one night and then steal all this money, and then suddenly the business is gone, and you move your address, and no one has ever seen you again. And it kind of, it's interesting of where, if you look at the history of MLMs, right, kind of like a legal pyramid scheme. The reason why the MLM kind of got started was they realized that people stopped trusting door-to-door salesmen, because they would sell a scam product, and by the time they realized that they were sold a product, these customers, the salesman is gone. And so people thought like, oh, but if we had sales representatives in the community that can't hightail and run, people would trust those people more. And so the person that was scammed moved from the actual end customer to the distributor, because those are the people that end up with all this debt and end up in these predatory pyramid scheme type of structures. And so we kind of just moved the risk in that sense. But it's about, I think the issue with capital that we kind of have to deal with is the issue of scale and trust in the system.
Well, absolutely. And, just really quick, the other problem that I find with most communists or socialists is that they're perfectly fine and capable of critiquing capitalism, but rarely do you see one critiquing communism or socialism. The vast majority of those people that do support communism have never read a bloody book about it. They've never read Das Kapital. I carry in my truck a copy of the Communist Manifesto. I read it when I'm bored, but very rarely do you find any of these folks that actually have read the material. They understand the criticisms, because quite frankly, when you do, you can no longer support it. It's just, it doesn't function on any level that you could possibly hope for, except for on small communes, 200 people, where that system might work. So I kind of want to throw it back at them in a way where it's very dishonest to critique another system without even being able to critique your own or even know anything about it. And that's what I find the most, the most abhorrent about, folks that actually support that. They've never read the Gulag Archipelago. They've never read, Yeonmi Park's In Order to Live. They've never read Banyam's book, Tomorrow I Die, right? They don't read these critiques of their own system that they endorse, whereas, quite frankly, capitalism has done an immense amount of harm in some areas, and we do have books that criticize that. I mean, slavery should be an early critique of that system. That was an early form of the capitalism that we practice today, and so we need to acknowledge that and make sure that doesn't ever happen again. But you rarely find that same level of integrity and honesty with the communists and the socialists.
Okay. To the points that you made, Steve, I've got to ask, do we really expect capitalism to be perfect? Do we really expect perfection from it? Because if you look at almost all economic systems, there are going to be flaws in these economic systems. And like the conversation I had with Stanley a while back, I told him that, look, there are good economic systems, or there are bad ones, or there are better economic systems and there are worse ones. And I think capitalism is one of the better ones. It's not the perfect one. I don't think we can ever have a perfect economic system, but it's one of the better ones. So those people who want to put an end to capitalism, what are you going to replace it with? And from what you just said, Steve, now many of these people do not really understand what the communism or socialism or the alternative economic systems are about. So once you deconstruct, or once you demolish what you have in the capitalist system, because there is no vacuum in nature, something has to take its place. What will take its place? How practical is it? How pragmatic is it in terms of putting it into practice? And these are questions that they don't get to ask.
Right. Well, to answer your question, we should always be critiquing our own system. We should always be looking for ways to improve it, to abolish bad ideas within our system. The one thing that I rarely hear anybody discuss is that if you look at human existence in the world, right, and how human beings interact in a free world, it's very chaotic. It's extremely chaotic. You have people who don't hold the same values. They don't value the same things the same way. The entire free world is basically one chaotic, almost. I can't say that, but it's extremely chaotic. And what you find is, if I can be so bold as to presume this, is capitalism is a physical manifestation of chaos theory in practice that represents humans being. Right. And so when you have an overly rigid structure such as communism, it is desperately bound to fail, because you can't lump human beings that are that complex and that amazing at being able to decide their own destiny. You can't put a system like that and just expect people to thrive. It was very common in communist Russia to have black markets. China had black markets. China at least smartened up and was like, well, maybe this is a good idea. And then you see them now, and they fully endorse the capitalist model. And now they're this very interesting hybrid of, what would be the word for it? Communist capitalism. Um, I couldn't say the word, but in every single instance of these, communist states, you find little glints of capitalism sprouting up, because capitalism is the best way to distribute the widest range of goods with the least amount of cost the most effectively. One of the reasons why the Soviet Union failed was because of this thing called the problem of central knowledge. You had one very small group of people trying to control for a massive group, and they just couldn't do it. There were stories of warehouses full of pots and pans, but soldiers didn't have bullets. And so, to better answer your question, is we should always be critiquing our system, always, but we should always be aware and acknowledge the mistakes that we've made so that we can move forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. I agree that we should always try to better any system. Just as individuals, we should always try to better ourselves on a daily basis. It's that basic human nature. There's going to be flaws in everything that humans do, and we can only try to improve ourselves. Right from the beginning of history, the story of humanity has been a story of trying to better ourselves, time over time over time, generation after generation, getting better. We don't look back at ourselves and say the whole of humanity is good for nothing. No, it's actually worth what we have right now. and we're bettering ourselves. I think that can be applied to capitalism as well, as one of the, in quote, better systems, in my opinion. It can be improved upon. It can never be perfect. It can be, no, it can't be perfect, but it can definitely be better than what it currently is. So there's a question from Anand to you, Steve. He said, there are many semi-capitalist countries all over the world. The world has tilted capitalism, not, I think he's saying not socialism or not communism in the other part. So how would you respond to this?
I just want to quick jump in, Charles, because I think when he's saying that the world has tilted capitalism, not capitalism, I think what he might be saying is that rather than the world being the thing that has, well, he's saying that the world is the thing that has profoundly impacted capitalism, not necessarily the other way around, maybe. I don't know. That's
Yeah,
just
it's,
another way he might be talking about it.
yeah.
Okay, so it's the world that has affected or influenced the basic nature of capitalism and not the other way around.
Well, I think that's going to be a very complex conversation with a lot of information attached to it. But the thing is if you actually Google, I believe it's the world poverty rate. The world poverty rate is expected to be abolished pretty much fundamentally within 10 to 15 years. And if you go to those places, some of those places are in Africa and other, third world countries, Middle East, everywhere where capitalism is instituted in some form or fashion, they succeed on almost every single metric. The quality of life gets better for everybody. So I think what you might have an argument here, Anon, is that I think both of the statements are true, being that capitalism influences the world and the world influences capitalism. It's almost designed to be that way. It's designed to work with people and people with the world. So I think it's a little bit of dualism here.
It's dynamic, right? That's how it's good, right?
It's absolutely designed to be that way.
Yeah. But kind of going to what you said, Steve, about, humans are chaotic beings, and that's what the markets are. That's what capitalism kind of ends up looking like. It's reflective of the participants of capitalism, kind of chaotic. And then, there are people who just want a planned economy. They want a managed economy. And I see that as, it could be a fundamental fear of uncertainty, right? You want things to be simple. Therefore, people who want a very stable system, what they think is a stable system, which would be a planned economy, they would prefer communism because they think that they can wrap their head around it, and not realizing that the world itself inherently is chaotic, and just because you hold one thing stable doesn't mean that chaos won't arise around it, and you can't fully control the world. You can't fully control everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, to channel Jeff Goldblum, life finds a way. Anywhere where you have an overly rigid structure, you're going to have chaos introduced into it, almost supernaturally. It will find a way. One person somewhere will be like, I don't like this, and they'll proceed to break it in some way to see where they can succeed and where they can be happy. That's one of the truly greatest characters of capitalism. Is it allows for variability, chaotic variability. So I think that's the biggest crux that the communist and the socialist, they just, and I should say the the socialist Democrats, they just don't understand that having a controlled system, a controlled economy, quite frankly, as far as I'm aware, has never worked except for on extremely small scales. And the U.S. is a massive country, The U.S. I mean Russia is a massive country. Africa is a combination of countries that make up a massive continent, and we find that in those type of environments, a free and open market to be able to trade openly without restriction almost inevitably meets the end of a greater positive for a greater good for the most amount of people over time.
Yeah, and it scales well in that sense, right? But then again,
Absolutely.
so that again, that scaling is a double-edged sword, right? Because people feel alienated, but at the same time, this is how well this is the price you pay for it working efficiently.
Can
Right.
I butt in here and just I have one thing to mention, and this is having to do with like Adam Smith. I think it's pertinent to what Chloe was just saying. You know, in the theory of moral sentiments that Smith wrote, it's his less known book. One of the things that he talks about is he talks about the benefits of capitalism, and one of the benefits, of course, is what you guys are describing, the essentially the rising tide lifts all ships kind of meme that I think most of us would agree with. However, he does have a concern about capitalism, and he says that basically the issue is that economic inequality in itself, the massive discrepancy between the very rich and the very poor, distorts people's what he called sympathies. Now he's using that in those days as what we would call empathy. It distorts people's ability to empathize with the very poor, because the fetishizing of richness, of having a lot of money, of driving fast cars, of having whatever the things are that money can buy, the fetishizing of that leads to a very negative outlook on the poor, when really the he kind of goes out of his way to say that capitalism only will work in a very moral society that's very concerned about the poor. In any other society, what's going to happen is that the poor and the less fortunate will constantly be either just kind of downtrodden, or essentially ready, like ripe for revolution. So I think that we need to be able to, and this is kind of getting back to what Charles was talking about earlier about oh well, someone eats too much, or spends too much money on things that aren't that important, like that's a personal problem. It's like, yes it is, but it's also a problem that's really deeply embedded in our psychology, that I think is only exacerbated when you have people who have like a lot of money, and then people who have like basically nothing. So I just wanted to insert that there.
Yeah, you have a point there. See, when I look at all this, what I think is that okay, this is what we have for now. What can we make of it? If it's so bad, what are we going to replace it with? These people are not proposing. They're not proposing something novel. They're not proposing something new. They're proposing something that's actually been tested and it didn't work. So that's where my critique comes from. Then another thing I wanted to mention, probably this constant attack on capitalism itself is actually how will I put it, is actually a result of the freedom that capitalism affords people that operates within this system. In a rigid market system, probably one that is controlled by the government, I don't think you would have the freedom to critique the system that much, or to challenge it. So the fact that capitalism itself is constantly under attack is actually a feature of itself. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, it's a feature.
Yeah, it's constantly being attacked, but it still comes out like essentially on top. Like we accept that, yeah, it's not perfect, but when confronted with alternatives, we kind of still choose this system. and we enjoy, at the end of the day, we kind of do enjoy the system. Yeah, like we can't just suddenly say, oh, everything's awful when the moment we hit a speed bump, because um I really don't think that a lot of these people who want to have a planned economy want to basically, have the government decide, you know, centrally, like what movies get produced, or oh, we're probably, we don't want to make Funko Pops anymore, like, like all of these little trinkets that they people enjoy, or a particular style of clothes, like things that people choose to express themselves individually. Those things won't be around anymore, because if you're looking to the government to have an efficient use of materials to provide towards the people, it can't afford individuality or expression.
Yeah, true. Which leads me to think that the people proposing these sorts of things, they're not thinking deeply about what they're not thinking deeply about what they're proposing. It's a knee jerk reaction. We don't like the system because we don't feel, probably they feel guilty for being wealthy. They feel guilty for being well off while other people are not so good. And to the point that I think Jordan Peterson has made this point before, that you know the more freedom a society have, sort of the more disparity you begin to see, because somehow individuality, natural tendencies, and so many things, choice comes into play, such that um, outcomes become so desperate. So in a capitalist society, I believe that yes, you will get more disparity, but the whole, there would be a much more uplifting of the well-being of everybody concerned, such that even the person at the bottom is still well off than in a rigid society where everybody is equally poor,
Yeah.
because it will be difficult to
Well,
get a communist place where everybody is equally rich.
I think that's um, a really accurate observation, and I'd just like to say that, you know, places where the opposition, so in this case, communists or Marxists, whatever you want to call them, there's a few contentious points here. One is we do have to realize the massive wage gap between America's working class and CEOs. Right, just massive, massive, bigger than it's ever been. You look at rent prices, housing prices right now. Now we're seeing an even bigger disparity between those who can afford houses and those who can't even afford rent. That could have 3 years ago. I just had my house reappraised this year. I couldn't purchase my house, and I couldn't afford the house that I own right now if I was to buy it today. And my wife and I, we don't make bad money. I mean, we combined, we make well over 6 figures a year. And what does that look like to someone who doesn't have a career? Let's say take someone who's just working an entry level position in a telemarketing firm, making 15 an hour. They're slaving all day, and what do they got to go home with? They go home with roommates because they can't afford a place of their own. So one thing that we have to admit as a critique of capitalism is its ability to create a large gap between the wealthy, the working class, and the middle class. Right, the gaps are getting bigger, and we aren't addressing that, and it's going to continue to get bigger. So there are ways in which we aren't being honest about what's happening, but I don't know how to fix it. I'm not an economist, but I can see the disparity.
So, you do have a point there. I guess there's a slight disagreement that I would have with it. And I had this thought probably like a few days ago of like the thing about capitalism, or at least in essence, freedom, right? Is it's a double-edged sword in the fact of it's a positive thing that you are free to choose to make decisions for yourself. You're free to choose, but that's also the bind of it is that you're also eventually you're free to choose your own like consequences, and you the people that wield freedom the most are the people that actually know how to constrain themselves somewhat. They choose to restrict themselves. So, for example, like there could be, let's say there are two people who are, entry level at a job in which they both are earning $50,000 a year, right? They're straight out of college, and then one person, it's like, woohoo, I have a job. I'm a young professional, and they kind of choose to have like the Sex in the City type of life. They go out with their friends for drinks, and they choose to purchase a lot of experiences, which is found to be fulfilling and everything like that. And then there's another person that chooses to, what, I'm gonna, I'm going to constrain myself, and I'm going to have mostly home cooked meals. I'm going to maybe just use the library instead of buying books, or they make completely different decisions. But the person that's going out and having fun is like, wow, you're to this other person who's on a budget. They choose to be on a budget. They're like, wow, you're so miserable, you should have fun like me, we're both young. But then at the end of the day, because this one person constrained their own freedom artificially at the beginning, by the time they retire, right, they're now free to do whatever they want because they've possibly accrued money. And then the person that kind of might have dipped into a more credit card debt or something like that, this person is going to be shaking their fist at the system, saying, you've robbed me of all of these things that I should have been able to afford. But it's because they kind of chose, and they made they chose to front load all of their choices at the beginning, which kind of constrain their choices near the end of their life or their career. And personally, I kind of try to live by the idea of like, I have to live by the consequences of my decisions, which kind of essentially lead up to, like, if I buy something, I force myself to use it even if I hate it, so that I remember never to buy that stupid thing again. And that kind of, I see that leads me to like save money, because it's like, oh, I know I never should buy that product again because it was awful, and I forced myself to remember that it was awful. But yet I know other people who, if they try something, oh, it doesn't work, they buy something else, and they buy something else, and then they end up accidentally buying that first thing that they bought because they don't remember that they didn't like it, and they've wasted so much more money than they did before. And so I think that you know we have to take we have to be responsible for our own freedom and realize that our decisions do have impact, and we have to kind of choose our battles, because we can't just win everything. And it makes perfect sense that at the beginning of someone's career, especially when they're young, you're probably going to be living like poor like a church mouse, right? You're probably going to have roommates. You're probably not going to have access to all of the highest quality or highest order of goods and services. And but like, you have to have image of the future, or a plan, or like you can have to look forward long enough, further enough, that you are willing to make a decision as to what's okay in the moment and what you're looking forward in the future. And the future isn't guaranteed, like everything isn't guaranteed. But I think that probably studies show that people who have that fortitude to willingly constrain themselves actually end up doing better in the long run. And I think, but that's the hazard of capitalism, is that people choose to be irresponsible, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That's their choice.
Well, if I can interrupt there, I'd like to push back on you a little bit. So if you take your example, right, you've got people who they restrain themselves, they do the right thing, right? Those people are going to succeed. Okay, I agree with you 100%, and I will not argue that. However, those aren't the people that need the help. You know what I mean? The people that are incapable of doing that, or weren't educated by their parents or their family to be able to do that. Those are the people that we're finding that are falling by the wayside. They're falling behind.
Mhm.
And so that's what I'm talking to when I say we have to acknowledge the bad parts of capitalism and account for that. I'm a libertarian. I'm a classic libertarian, not one of these new libertarians, and I fully believe in the employment of social programs, responsible social programs. Um, you know, changing education so that we actually have courses in high school about finance, taxes, understanding what property taxes are, understanding how to invest your money, right? Many of these things we could do very easily that we're not doing. You know what I mean? And so I don't want that to sound like I'm negating what you said, because your point is absolutely valid and you're 100% right. And I'm always impressed with how many times you're right when we talk. Not because you're a female, it's just because I don't know you that well. And you nail points. You nail points constantly. And so I don't want you to think that I'm pushing back because I disagree with you. I absolutely do agree with you, but it's the places where we suck that I'm concerned about.
Well,
You know what I mean?
Well, I don't disagree with you. I do think we absolutely need better basic public education, because I have, like have tried to help some certain people where I realize, oh, you literally don't know any of this stuff. Like I've tried to counsel some people who've like, they say like I have $80 in my bank account and I don't have I'm not going to get paid for 3 weeks. And so I've literally, tried to sit them down of like, this is how you maybe choose correctly, for a grocery, for groceries, right? And try to help them make intelligent decisions as to what to buy. Do not buy name brand, maybe buy in bulk, all these very basic things. And it is surprising of what people don't know. And if only people kind of were exposed to some very basic information of, you do have control over this. Or one thing that kind of blew this person's mind was, she had like broken glasses and they were just constantly kind of falling off her face. And I said, you can go to Walmart and get your glasses adjusted and fixed for free. You just need to, educate some people on some of these kind of basic general services that are available, like utilizing like libraries, right? And even something big, that I think not that many people talk about is stuff like Job Corps. Oh my gosh, Job Corps is so crucial for those types of people that you're talking about, Steve, that might even have like intellectual disabilities. And they still need to find a career, and they still need to figure out how they literally teach them life skills. They literally teach them a trade and a skill, and they leave those programs with a job.
Welcome back, Dr. Mason. Okay, Dr. Mason is still muted. So, great conversation so far. I want us to wrap up in the next 3 minutes, because I don't want this to be more than an hour, 30 minutes. So, well, great observations so far, but I just have this last question. And the question is, how do you explain, those people who are doing well off being the ones shouting so much about the system, that the system is broken and it needs to be fixed? How do you square that?
Guilt.
Or they just don't
Well,
know how well they're doing. Like they actually maybe think that they're the downtrodden. And really, when you look at it, like, even if you are someone who's not doing as well in America, you're probably doing a lot better than someone else in some other place in the world where, like, for example, if you were to have an accident or something like that, like, there wouldn't be a hospital within 500 miles to take you to, you know, that kind of thing.
I guess I don't understand the question. Can you rephrase that a little bit, Charles?
okay, so the question is, I get to see many of these people who complain that capitalism is broken and all that. They happen to be people who are living very good lives. Probably their parents are very wealthy. So how do you square those who are actually benefiting from the system crying foul about the system?
Oh, so you're talking about the college student that's crying about how bad capitalism when it's
Yeah.
mom and dad paying their way. You
Yeah.
know, um, I think the best way I could square that is that there is a certain level of unchecked hypocrisy that these people aren't doing on their own. There's no self investigation. There's no thought to it. That they profess to care about the poor or the downtrodden, but all they can do is very limited things. Like march, which is good. Marching is good, and protesting is good, but I don't really see that as functionally changing anything for anybody right now. It's just making you feel better. And so I would say hypocrisy. I think there's a certain level of hypocrisy that's not being checked. That would be my answer.
And
Thank you,
also,
Steve.
and also, I think it's partially they actually, they talk about workers' rights and all these types of things, but they've never actually lived that life, right? And so sometimes I see kind of an obliviousness as to how a working class person actually lives, or how much, like how much does a gallon of milk cost, or how much is a pound of rice cost. And they're being fed like this image of like kind of infantilizing poorer people, not necessarily poor people, but they just have this idea of like, oh my gosh, it's so awful. And they see how much they pay for like something at Whole Foods or something that is, they choose to go to a place that has high quality and therefore is more expensive. And then they kind of extrapolate, oh wow, like this must be so awful for a poorer person, but they don't actually know the mechanics of how a poorer person lives, or they project certain problems onto them that aren't really accurate. So all of their solutions are gonna be tone deaf and miss the mark most of the time.
Wow,
I,
I walked in on some serious cynicism, so I'm about to say something that's gonna give a little bit of nuance to this conversation. I hope.
All right.
Um,
Go ahead, Dr. Shina.
so from my perspective, now admittedly I missed a lot of the conversation, but just answering the question on the table, there is and has been a history of this idea that the social responsibility for what's called uplift, right, rests on the elite, or at least the people who aren't at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. And in African American literary studies, or in African American history, this means that usually it's the role of the intelligentsia, it's the role of the artists. And there have been consistent debates for over a century now, even just within African American circles, about the role of those said people when it comes to the quote unquote masses, or the folk, right? That the sort of average, not meant in a pejorative way, but just like the average person, right? And then also, what is their relationship or responsibility to the working class? And from my view, while some of what has already been said can certainly be true for some of these people who are then now uh, speaking the loudest against the sort of systems that they view as being problematic or creating problems, I also think it's the case that there's an entire history of people who have believed in good faith that it is their responsibility to be the loudest about the problems that plague uh, uh, the majority of people in this country across in different time periods. And I think too, this has also led to a fair amount of criticism, and I think also misunderstanding, because what the question that's on the table is also resonating with the questions that would also come up during the time period, right? Like, what does the intelligentsia, or what what do the quote unquote black elite, what do these people have to say when it comes to circumstances that, for all intents and purposes, many of them had never experienced? Uh, and yet, and still, you still had those people feeling like that was part of their responsibility. And I know for me, I might be privileged now, and the example that you gave, the concrete example, spoke to a student, I guess, whose parents are well off or something like that. So some amount of privilege happening there. But I know for me, I might be privileged and well off now, but I was sleeping on park benches when I was 17, right? Like I've lived homelessness time and time again throughout my childhood and my adulthood, and I've experienced the exact opposite of privilege in those arenas. And so I feel even more impassioned to speak out against certain things that I observe in the societies for all of those reasons, which I would say are the right reasons. Um, and then the last thing I'll say too, and I don't know if this I feel like is a slippery slope. I think Chloe used the word infantilization of people that can sometimes happen. So that is a thing. But I know from my experience, I've done a lot of work in the Mississippi Delta, and I'm talking about the level of impoverishment that most people can't even imagine, such that to go to the local grocery store and everything, including the frozen food, is expired. And then I think to myself, okay, you know what? I'm just going to get a box of tea. And then the tea is expired. I've never in my life seen expired tea before until I went to the Mississippi Delta and Arkansas. And I experienced this time and time again. So that to get food that's not expired, or even to get something like tea, I have to drive an hour, over a bridge to go to a Walmart, the closest Walmart and stuff like that. I'm talking about like serious impoverishment and lack of access. Um, I think that more people would do well to analyze and even if not go to those communities, like know that those communities do exist. So while the numbers might not be as harsh, I guess, as the media would have us believe. There are pockets of Americans where poverty is a real thing. It's a persistent problem, and who else is supposed to be speaking up about these things, right? I don't know, but that's just my perspective.
So I guess I want to be more specific about like the type of people that I was specifically talking about it, because I wasn't talking about like, let's say there's a social worker who is servicing a community that is impoverished. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. But I guess what I was talking about is people that kind of like I think there is this one guy who is I think he works at Fox or something like that, and I think he advocates for communism, and he literally grew up rich. Like he is literally the son of um someone who owns who is the head of a frozen food company or something like that. And I'm not talking about Tucker Carlson. I think he was like but it's someone who's is like I think associated with communism or socialism, and he's advocating for all of these things when he's literally lived a very, very rich, privileged life, and he actually is advocating for things that he is never confirming if they're true, or in actually things that might ultimately hurt the people that he is claiming to fight for. But it's kind of obvious that he's more so fighting for his own clout. And so I worry about people who are at a level of influence and privilege that are just using these topics as kind of a virtue signaling type of situation, and they're using these topics as pawns. And like let's say their solution doesn't work out if it's ever implemented, they will just kind of dismiss it, and they don't actually necessarily reframe their ideas or take accountability to maybe my idea kind of didn't work. They don't actually kind of self-correct. It's more so of just, I don't know, sometimes it looks like a little bit of clout chasing, and they don't actually I guess put their money where their mouth is, right? That's one critique of like someone like Hassan Piker or Vosh, who constantly advocate for like co-ops in terms of businesses, right? And someone said like, hey, how about you start one? You have enough money. You just bought a $3 million mansion. You have enough money to at least invest, let's say, $500,000 into a co-op and see if it works. If you believe in your ideas working, and if we're talking specifically about communism and socialism, try it. And they just constantly kind of dismiss those types of things. And so I guess my critique wasn't necessarily specifically about the intelligentsia. It's more so about people who are it's kind of weird. They're like influencers, right? And then they're never actually held accountable to the ideas that they put out, but yet they're actually making a lot of money from exposing a lot of these ideas and trying to popularize it.
I'd like to really quickly just acknowledge what Dr. Mason said, because I think that was a valuable insight. Because after she said that, I remembered having a conversation, and he's 100% right. Because one of the perils that we suffer when we get into these systems, we get comfortable, right? None of us in this room has ever seen a Great World War, right? Many of us weren't even alive when the last great communist state was fell. There's a few of us in here that might have been alive when the Berlin Wall fell, but overall we've had, aside from 9/11, we've had a pretty dang good life. And what happens is we forget how bad it can be. And I think that speaks to what Dr. Mason was saying, was that sometimes we tend to forget how good we have it, and the responsibility that we should all share to ensure everybody is succeeding and getting the most out of the system that we are all advocating here. So I just wanted to bring that up really quick.
Thanks, Steve. Because Charles, I know you're trying to end this, but I'm sorry. I have just one more thing, if I could have a moment. Thank you. Yeah. Because one thing that I find pernicious, or that I find operates perniciously within society and public discourse, is this tendency to validate or invalidate a person's position based on their experience or lack thereof. Like, people try to play this game with me often. If I come in with my theory of racistness, and then the first thing they want to know is, have I ever experienced racism? Because they're extrapolating all of these things that I'm not actually saying, and they're assuming I have these ideas because I have never been subjected to racism and things of that nature. Or another sort of accusation or presumption is that because I have lighter skin, this somehow makes me inclined to have the ideas that I have. And so I think that can be that those attempts can be a pernicious thing, such that the people who are well off, that, to my mind, that doesn't preclude them from participating in these conversations. And even if they capitalize off of it, right? Because we do live in a capitalist society, to the point of this session. Even if they capitalize off of it, I don't know that is enough to, I guess, invalidate their efforts, if you will, because there is a problem that I don't know the specifics of the example you're talking about, Chloe, but there is a problem to be pointed to. And I think the people who have the influence and the people who have the platform, just like I use my own platform for this, I think that society could be more productive and generative if people who have eyes on them and their voices are being heard, if they are speaking out against these things, even if they make money in the process, right? Because we do live in a capitalist society where that's a thing. And, like, if I'm doing good in the world and I'm doing well for my family, I don't know who's out there to question my intent. So that's the only thing.
All right. So I think this is a good place to end the conversation today. So thank you all very much for coming to this conversation. It was really wonderful. I mean, like I said, these spontaneous conversations usually are much more interesting because the thoughts are natural, they are on the spot. And I really want to especially appreciate Dr. Mason for giving us the caption of this series, Thinking Out Loud, because she always says, after every stream, she says, thank you for allowing us to think out loud in your platform. And I thought, that's a very, very interesting interesting phrase to use for something like this. So I believe we're going to be doing more of this. Probably we'll have another one on maybe Saturday or Sunday. I want to make it regular, either on Saturday or on a Sunday. We have this session where we just come and talk about stuff. So I believe we've had a very fruitful conversation today. I really want to appreciate everyone. Chloe, thank you as usual. Benjamin, thank you. Steve, a wonderful conversation, wonderful insights. Thank you very, very much. Every other person who has joined the stream today, I really appreciate you guys. And I'll catch you in another live stream shortly. So let's have a great day, have a great night, have a great afternoon. I'm off to bed right now. So bye, guys.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Charles. Everybody have a
Bye.
good day.
Bye.